welcome in this afternoon's program. Today, the plantation plot participating artist, Cian Dayrit, will discuss his art practice and its intersections with activism and geography. Cian's work investigates notions of power and identity as they are represented and reproduced in maps and other institutionalized media. He often deploys grassroots tools like counter-cartography, mapmaking, and that challenges dominant perspectives of land and boundaries and critically questions colonial perspectives. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Cian Dayrit.
Hello. Okay. Thank you for the beautiful introduction. Thank you for having me, ILHAM Gallery and Cadiz, and thank you for Xiao for putting me into this seeing the work. So here are two of my works here, and I'm just going to be doing a little show and tell, so please forgive me in advance if I'm going to be rambling for the next hour or so. We'll try to keep it a bit succinct. My name is Cian Dayrit. I am from Manila, Philippines. I'm a visual artist, as you may all know. I'm going to be talking about my practice at large and how it intersects within my work as an activist and my work as a geographer as well. As the introduction had said, a lot of my work talks about different notions of space and power and how these are represented and reproduced with different medium and objects such as maps and museums and monuments and other institutionalized media, how different infrastructures and platforms of power dictate such things as like heritage and history and authorship. So I got interested in looking at maps in particular because other than like particularly antiquarian maps of the Philippines and Southeast Asia, not just because of their, I guess, like visual formats. They're such kind of like the antiquarian maps of the region are such kind of like powerful representations of space and time, but also of power. And these are overtly political objects that has a lot of violence within them as they chase borders and boundaries that are imagined to be of territory and ownership. So coming back into the Philippines, like I speak, a lot of my work speak around the ideas and discourses around the agrarian question and peasant struggles in the Philippines and in the region. And as you can see here, there's a triangle of Philippine society. Categorically, like 75% belongs to what is known as the peasant sector. So these includes indigenous national minorities, farm workers, and small farmers who are also understood historically to be landless because of the issue of land monopoly in the Philippines that stem from colonial times. Like when we were occupied and colonized by Spain for 300 years, they had introduced what you call the Regalian Doctrine, wherein most of the land is controlled by the church and eventually turned over to American corporations in the 1900s, and so on and so forth. So we understand Philippine society to be semi-colonial and semi-feudal. I'm going to be talking a lot about this in different angles throughout the works that I will be presenting here. This is a painting from a few years ago of the upside-down archipelago of the Philippines, wherein it's like roughly plotting out different spaces of development, aggression, and militarization, particularly the presence of US military bases in the Philippines. So, you can see here an infographic made by Ibon Foundation. As you can see in the heading, it's large land holdings amidst peasant landlessness. So this is exactly like the contradiction that my work tries to highlight in different shapes and in different forms. Here is a small selection of the largest haciendas and plantations and areas, vast tracts of land claimed by landlords and corporations and institutions in the archipelago of the Philippines. So vast tracts of land are used to produce cash crops historically and until today, such as sugarcane and Cavendish bananas and pineapples, all to feed into the global supply chain. So the economy is also kind of known to be import dependent and export oriented. And despite all of this, there's a lack of food production in the Philippines. So a lot of the different economic policies and kind of like political institutions like, are geared towards this kind of economic relations to feed into the global supply chain, like I said, and to benefit multinationals and the local counterparts, the bureaucrat capitalists. And what I try to do is I try to, one, understand all of this for myself, because at the end of the day, or like at the beginning of the day, like I identify as an artist. I had my undergrad and majored as a painter. So if anything, like how I understand things is how I can represent things. And in the context of being a painter and making landscape paintings, I try to understand space for what it is in different frequencies. So I try to understand and look for the contradictions within the space. When you see a landscape, it's not just like a bare, neutral, geological format. There are features within it that also influence its shape throughout time. So, for example, when you look at a piece of land and then there's a road, what does the road connect? You know? If the road is used to transport crops from the archipelago to outside, it somehow also is a way to terraform it throughout history and power. So I'm interested in the different contradictions and the different features in the landscapes that actually influence and dictate its terraforming. And also, like in that context, I become interested in the ways in which people contribute to this terraforming or like defining the shape of the land. So the peasant struggle comes in because the vast majority of the Filipino masses, like I said, fall within the category of peasant sector. And what does that mean in terms of tilling and working the land? And who has agency with how these spaces are shaped literally and economically? So a lot of the pieces and the objects that I do within my own individual studio practice talk about different layers and different forms and levels of resistance. Because as I may have mentioned earlier, a lot of the early anti-colonial revolts in the history of the Philippines stem from peasant and agrarian-related issues. A lot of the early anti-colonial skirmishes and small guerrilla forces were composed of the peasantry. So on the right here is a small tapestry that maps out different spaces wherein bungkalan, or a collective land cultivation that is being used by landless peasants as a form of protest, like extrajudicial protest, because they are landless, because land is taken from them by large companies and landlord oligarchs. Even though there is an agrarian reform program that makes sure that they are in possession of some sort of land to work for themselves. And bungkalan, the collective land cultivation, is a militant way of taking out the cash crops and planting food crops for their own sustenance. So if anything, it's actually a beautiful form of resistance because it is an actual way of bringing the land back into its format of productivity that serves the people that actually tills it, as opposed to a violent way of tilling the land that uses, wherein you produce cash crops for the benefit of a larger entity, such as a multinational company. And is very much dependent on synthetic agrochemicals and pesticides. So by being a peasant advocate and talking about land rights issues and food security and human rights issues and social justice, you are kind of intersecting a lot of um, these different kind of angles and intersections of advocacy work and rights-based kind of conversations. And I guess like being also a contemporary artist, there's also this kind of question of how this is not just discussion, this is not just pretty things in a gallery, but how all of this can also kind of translate into direct action, how all of this can also somehow kind of translate into organizing in the grassroots and mobilizing and forming dialogues with representatives of authority, and so on and so forth. So what does activism mean within the context of contemporary cultural work and space making? The diagram you see here on the left side is kind of a mind map of this organization called SACA, which I co-founded in 2017. SACA is Sama-samang Artista para sa Kilosang Agrario. In English, it translates to Artists Alliance for Agrarian Reform and Cultural Development. Now, cultural work has always been very much present and integral in organizing worldwide, because we recognize that it's not just a question of politics and economics. Of course, it's also a question of culture. And cultural work is very much like a big part of how we understand things amongst ourselves as individuals, as part of collectives, as parts of societies, and it's how we translate our struggles to other people's struggles and how we form networks of solidarity. So SACA is kind of nothing entirely new in terms of the history of cultural work within peasant advocacy or activism in the Philippines or Southeast Asia or the Global South. But then for the Philippines, it's a little bit new in a sense that its membership or the people who join, who come and go within its alliance are also composed of people from various fields of cultural work. And I guess it's the idea of cultural work and what this means today to be like a broad kind of categorization of how people participate in different platforms of culture. So what I mean to say is we're not only a group of street theater people or painters who paint murals. We are also people who have to work in advertising agencies. We are also people who work as high school teachers and have practices as choreographers in the evening. We are also people who are doing copyright but also writing poetry. So it's kind of understanding the broader platform of what contemporary cultural work has become within this kind of neoliberal time that we are collectively experiencing, and how we can connect that broad kind of idea of cultural work into talking about the issues that are happening not within this petit bourgeois sphere of our experiences in the city. Because whether we like it or not, like SACA is composed of like middle class cultural workers in the city, but talking about historical struggles that are happening in the countryside. So on my part, I'm also understanding it from a geographical and spatial point of view, that there is like the outside other, and then the urban kind of enclave, wherein like discourses happen, but then not necessarily connected to the action or the resistance or the struggle or the oppression that is theorized in the university, theorized in the discussions like that are actually happening in the countryside. So it's kind of like an interesting simultaneous networking of ideas and realizations of where we are at in society at large. So to talk about like the work as a cultural worker and then the work as a peasant advocate is also to understand the different layers of narrative and different layers of, well, one layer is like conversation, for example, but another layer is policy. No? How do we understand things in terms of how corporations and the government defines land via the language of policy and laws? So one such problem that is articulated in peasant struggle in the Philippines is land use conversion. Because if you survey or you speculate the land in the countryside, you make a big map and then you say, oh, this is agrarian area, this is residential mixed-use commercial area. And how a lot of these spaces are either public or private. And sometimes it shifts or kind of merges within public and private. And what it all means in terms of who gets to decide what happens in this land. And land, space, resources, what have you, right? So land use conversion is a sort of policy, like a neoliberal policy, wherein different people, stakeholders, particularly the ruling land-owning elite, get to influence state by reclassifying agrarian land into commercial, mixed-use, real estate, industrial, things like that. So in a way, this land use conversion policy is being used to kind of change the categorization of supposedly land that is to make food is land that can be invested on for different things. Because it's also a way to get around the policies of agrarian reform, which is supposed to bring the land back to the farmers, to the tillers. So I'm showing these two images because this is a peasant leader that is based in the Bulacan region, like just north of Manila, who I was working with. He visited my studio for a little bit, and then we started talking to learn like the ins and outs of the issues of the region. And then as we were talking, like he was also, I asked him to draw the map of the map that represents the history of his region and the struggle for land there. See, like it's not so far away from the city center in Manila, actually. And this map that he's drawing on the textile here is just half of this city called San Jose del Monte. The other half is actually highly urbanized. But then this other half that he's drawing is the more kind of rural countryside that is mostly largely agricultural. But then he was saying in our conversations that like throughout the past couple of years, like more and more like large families and corporations have been like fencing up large swaths of it and like putting in checkpoints for military and police to kind of like kick them out of the land so they can reclassify it, they can convert its land use to other more marketable or profitable uses. So this is one such manifestation of like an ongoing thing. So this is historical, this has been happening for many generations. But how do people today kind of understand these things wherein like when you whip out your phone, you get advertisements for new real estate, which is very attractive for investment, things like that. But then like this idea of like this is your reality on your phone as it is peddled by real estate corporations, and that's the reality of their everyday, of their previous generation, of their next generation, if there is such at all, right? So this contradiction that 7 out of 10 farmers remain landless in the Philippines is not just a guess number. Like a lot of the farmers are actually landless, which means they have to be hired as something like near slaves to till the land, if to till the land at all, to participate in food production. So it, like I said, it intersects the discourse of food and land rights justice and social justice. In some of the work that I do, it also focuses or zeroes in on particular issues or particular features within the landscapes that I look at. One such series is this work about Cavendish bananas in the Philippines. So like sometimes I have I work with several collaborators as an artist, but then I work with scholars and researchers and ethnographers and other geographers who have been doing groundwork, and kind of like, I guess, like their output would be like to write papers, which I can kind of translate into objects, which other people can kind of translate into stories. Or sometimes it works in different ways. Like, so we can go into community and share stories with different participants in the community, such as farm workers or farmers associations, or just normal everyday people who happen to be living around the area. And then we do some sort of, I guess, like in different words, but then one such way of looking at it is like a basic masses integration. One such way of looking at it is engaged ethnography. One such way of looking at it is just integrating with your local community to kind of understand, like, what is how do they understand their everyday experiences in terms of how it is also kind of understood by the state and corporations. So, for example, I worked with an anthropologist who has been working with Cavendish bananas in Davao region in Mindanao, and then we went to the area to talk to different groups and ask them about their experiences with water sources in particular, and how their proximity to banana plantations and then the use of agrochemical pesticides that are aerial sprayed for the production of Cavendish bananas, how these affect their everyday health conditions, and then the quality of water that they use, since they get their water from deep wells and the streams. And obviously, like, they have seen like a very kind of a severe impact on health throughout the past decade or two. And this was also kind of like in line within the history and then the rampant expansion of plantations in the region. And this is not to say that expansions of plantations have not just popped up within the past decades. It's also a historical thing, but then it also evolves in terms of its dependence to agrochemical corporations. So this work, for example, if you can look closely, but then it will have like the logos of the different countries where we export to, and then the logos of different corporations that are involved within Cavendish banana production and agrochemical companies and all the chemical components of the agrochemicals that are being used. So in a way, it tells the story of the Cavendish banana as this zombie plant, GMO. It's actually it's not a natural plant, Cavendish banana. It was made particularly for the global supply chain. It was engineered, the species, to resist a particular strain of virus that attacks that attacks other banana plants, because it's also very unnatural to plant them in a monocrop way. So if anything, the whole mode of production of plantations is contradictory to any ecosystem. It's more of like an industrial kind of land use. And then, so this is how my studies would sometimes look like. This is a very clean version. And then this is how, these are different forms of the work as they come along. And some work are also, if not about cash crops, or they're about mineral extraction or mining. So this is the work of this organization called ULIRAT, who I also collaborate with. So ULIRAT is a collective of militant geographers and GIS people. In this particular, it's a poster basically, and it's very explicit in its message, because it says, this is a map of mining tenements in the Philippines, in a typical map, the cartographer would place a base map underneath the data to show its geographical context. However, the overwhelming abundance of mining tenements allows us to recognize that this is the Philippine archipelago. We found no need for a base map. So now the question also is, like, what do you consider as mining tenements? So that's a perfect question. Thank you very much. Because, of course, a lot of mining corporations retaliated after this poster came out. Like, what do you mean anyway, you know? So any mineral extractive industry that is corporate and large scale. So that means reclamation projects and quarrying for sand and gravel. That also is considered. But then just to understand the scale and gravity of such extractive activity on a large-scale corporate level is definitely frightening to see. So, for example, in the Philippines, because of neoliberal policies, so I try not to use those words too much because it's also kind of like, I need to understand. But then, just the basic, I guess, like the idea, the basic contradiction is that there is a law. There is a law that is passed in the 90s, wherein like world neoliberal restructuring about like free trade and whatnot, that disallows the the Philippines as a country to extract and process our own minerals. Even though we are very mineral rich, we are rich in copper, nickel, silver, gold, enough times to industrialize several times over, but we are not allowed to extract and process. It has to be the multinational companies, the Australians, the Japanese, the Canadians, and all the other like foreign multinational companies that dig up our land, take out the raw minerals, and sell it back to us as processed goods. So none of our things are locally produced. Even the nails, even the needles are all imported. So it's kind of like a very, very bad like connect to the idea that it is export dependent and import oriented. And how do we understand all of these things in a landscape, right? This is a map of Mindanao region, mapping out mineral extraction, large scale, and agribusiness plantation. So here you can see banana, rubber, pineapple, sugarcane, cacao, oil palm, and it's everywhere in the region. Two such examples of regional maps that I have made that are plotting out different spaces of militarization and plantations and haciendas are this of Central Luzon region and the Cordillera region. So a lot of the imagery that I use around are kind of patterned from Filipino anting-antings or talismans, which I guess has a little bit of a weighty influence in my artistic practice because I was working with a lot of religious imagery when I was growing up and beginning as an artist. And then it kind of became my own way also of reinterpreting several kind of complicated things. It's my way of making infographics and using my own kind of visual vocabulary to make infographics out of these contradictions. So for example, there's this little image here of an imaginary mountain, but that became a hole in the ground, so mineral extraction. And some of the images as well would be influenced by the drawings of community members who I've talked to and participants in the workshops that I've been kind of facilitating, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But another notable thing, I guess, in some of these textile works, which you don't see in these ones in real life, but in some of these textile works are loaded with these QR code patches, which you can go near and scan, and then the QR code patches will direct you to links to journals and alternative media reports and human rights fact sheet reports and other related material that connects you to the stories of the people on the ground in relation to social justice issues and whatnot. So in a way, like this is my way to cite the sources, some sort of building a working bibliography of all the material that I consider and that I use to put into the object. It tries to be a scholarly work as well by citing its sources. And it tries to do the work of kind of internationalist activists because as a textile work, you can easily fold it and smuggle it around to avoid customs and taxes of the Philippines that is very corrupt. So in a way, it also kind of engages with that materiality as an artwork. Because it's textile, it also kind of looks into the history of tapestries, which are nomadic murals. But then instead of representing estates or like private property of fiefdoms, besides being objects that are counterparts of feudal opulence, these works attempt to become anti-feudal objects that highlight the stories of the masses that are otherwise marginalized and disenfranchised and systemically silenced. So these are two other maps that are showing haciendas in central Luzon area. And these are, for example, this Hacienda Luisita is this large, like 6,400 hectare patch of land that is owned by like a local dynasty. And then within this family, they have had two past presidents, haha. And then one of the first president, the matriarch, became the president after the ousting of the former dictator Marcos Sr., who is the father of the current president. So, haha. But then within the administration of Cory Aquino, the matriarch, she drafted and passed this agrarian reform program that we still kind of subscribe to today. So agrarian reform is like it's a crucial, I guess, like instrument within Philippine society historically because farmers have generationally been landless. So it became one of her landmark policies, the Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Program. There's a QR code there somewhere. But thing is, to have an agrarian reform program drafted and passed within the administration of a large landlord herself, it is bound to be kind of riddled with a lot of loopholes, wherein it's almost impossible for the agrarian reform beneficiaries or the farmers to actually claim their land. So we're kind of working with a lot of these different kind of, this tangled political realities that we kind of like have to represent to understand. And so like the ongoing problems and issues and struggles of these communities are ongoing until today. And I have been also kind of very much around and in participation of these struggles, not just as a visual artist, but also as a researcher or as part of SACA, and as a peasant advocate in general. So for example, this Hacienda Tinang, this is also like an ongoing case wherein the land, the family that kind of like is taking over the land is keeping the land from the agrarian reform beneficiaries. Basically, is keeping the land from the farmers who actually legally own them by keeping the papers and by maintaining their position in politics. So coincidentally, the landlords are the local mayors. So it's been like several years since the farmers and the farmers associations found out that, hey, we're agrarian reform beneficiaries. We actually have somewhere titles for our land. So they started looking and organizing and finding legal representation. And they found actually the papers and hey, like, we're here. So like, it's not entirely like a violent thing. Like they're doing the due process of of finding the legality within it, and then forming an organization to represent themselves, and finding legal advisors and lawyers who are also representing them. But to almost to no avail, because you're going up against the mayor, the landlord mayor. So it's kind of like an interesting story that is winding in different directions. At some point, they decide that we should organize and do a bongkalan. I said a while ago, it's a collective land cultivation, wherein, in this sense, you take out sugarcane crops and you plant food crops. So myself, along with like a larger contingent of advocates, like cultural workers, painters, and poets, and media people, and scholars, and other friends, just came in also to help out within the bongkalan. And this is something that we systematically do. We send out large delegations of people who just want to learn about it and help out in the activities of bongkalan, or just have a breakfast picnic and share stories with the associations. In this particular case, in 2022, we were all arrested and detained for 4 days and given several criminal charges. Of course, because we were a huge contingent, it was almost automatic that it was very noisy. So like the noise reverberated all throughout academia, the art world, and different, I guess, platforms, not just in the Philippines, but internationally. So it was also kind of an interesting time to kind of reaffirm one's idea of solidarity. Like, what am I doing here as an artist? Why am I getting criminal cases as an artist? And it kind of connects all the dots, actually. It kind of does make sense that this is what we need to be making. This is what we need to be making art about. We've heard this exact same story, and we know it in theory, but this is actually happening now. And like all these criminal charges, extended for well, as far as I know, there was no like actual dismissal to some of them. But then like the case had progressed from like the court to the Department of Agrarian Reform, which in effect makes it not a criminal case and an agrarian dispute. But even then, the idea of sort of us having to us not knowing if any time we would need to be called out for involvement in things like this. I mean, so this is one of many stories that kind of relate and connect like one's participation within like art practices to the outside world. So what is the studio? How do we understand the studio and the practice? A lot of the work maps out policy, like I said. So this is one such work that enumerates and talks about different militaristic policies within the Duterte administration. It's somehow like an object that talks about the culture and history of the Philippine the Armed Forces of the Philippines as a tool, because the Armed Forces of the Philippines was created by United States when we were a colony, and to put in question like its autonomy within the country, because if anything, like the United States is still like the biggest patron of the Armed Forces of the Philippines. So sometimes like, they have some sort of agency within themselves. So like taking a step back from the objects that I do in the studio. Oh, so this is more militarization stuff. Oh. Okay. A lot of the work, a lot of the imagery, a lot of the stories that are re-understood as policy, that are re-understood as object, that are re-understood as narrative, a lot of them come from drawings such as this. So these are map drawings that were made by different community members who I've been talking to. I started facilitating mapping workshops to different peasant groups. And these workshops happen in spaces such as protest camps or picket lines or little festivals or the communities themselves when we visit. So this is like a quick like kind of storytelling tool wherein people think about their experiences within their respective spaces in relation to land and displacement and where they get their resources, where they live, where are their rights violations, and so on and so forth. So the guide questions kind of vary depending who the participants are. So initially it had started as a method, like an extra experimental method in research that I used to do. But then quite immediately I had recognized that the stories and then the narratives that are shared in these workshops are vulnerable and very personal and intimate, that I thought I should kind of reframe this workshop as a research method to like an actual branch that somehow crosses between organizing and art, in a way to give justice to the stories and not just count them as cold data. Because they are not just cold data. And I think that's the problem with how we take these stories. They just are cold data that end up in documents that are fact sheets, and then lawyers need to make sense out of it, and then journalists will have to kind of steer it a certain way. So if anything, these are immediate, direct artifacts of struggles that are ongoing. I'll show more later, but I don't know why this is here. But anyway, I'll just take a step back a little bit to show how like policy is also mapped out here, like different like historical policies are mapped out. This looks like a map, but it's more of a timeline. And then this looks like a diagram of a pig, but then its parts is also kind of talking about different policies. So I'm just showing different ways of how to map ideas and concepts and policies using these, like the map, anatomical. Plantation scene, also kind of like a newish plantation no scene, also kind of like a newish formulation of how we understand kind of world dynamic based on plantation economies here. And the textiles, other than in museums or galleries, locally and internationally, they also go back into communities sometimes. This is my collaborator, by the way. His name is Henricus. His name is there. It's always in the work because I credit him always. Been working with Henricus for about a decade now. He was a teenager. Now he has a girlfriend. But yeah, he's my go-to embroiderer guy, and I also have go-to like wood carver people. So this guy here, Dunning Ramos, like he's a peasant leader. He's currently running for senator. It's our senatorial elections after this weekend. So actually interesting to see like the different platforms that we really need to occupy. And activism doesn't just happen in the streets if other people think that it's just protest. No, it's a lot of educating, it's a lot of organizing, it's a lot of talking to your right-wing uncle, it's a lot of these personal, intimate things as well. But other than the streets and the home and the university, like there's also, we have allies in court, we have allies in government, and hence, like people like Dunning Ramos, like he had to step up also, and to have a platform for all the advocacy or for all the work and translate all this groundwork, this life work of groundwork into policy is also another level of resistance. Yeah. Okay, so going back a little bit to the mapping workshops. I said a little bit like I've been doing it in different spaces. It's been an integral part of my practice. It looks like, yeah. So this is like, there has been like hundreds already done. So it's also kind of like an accumulation of this archive, which I've been doing since 2017. I've been thinking about it. The archive has been growing since then. And then the workshop module has also been evolving since then, which got me into studying geography again, wherein I'm working on this pedagogical tool so that I don't need to be the one to do it forever. So basically, it's cognitive mapping. We have an idea of what cognitive maps are. It's nothing too novel, you know, like people do it back in the 60s and 70s, like behavioral psychologists. Cognitive maps are basically how we process our notions of space in our heads, and then how we translate it in whatever way into like a visible or tangible format. So basically what we're trying to do here, these map drawings are like cognitive maps on paper, right? And the workshop is very, very basic because it needs to be as kind of comprehensible as possible. So always it is done in A4 paper because I also kind of encourage the participants to do it as an individual, but to think as part of a collective. So there's that kind of jump between self and community that is forwarded within this activity. And then it's also just with pencils and pens because we avoid because not every day do you draw your map, and sometimes you just want to draw, you just want to color. But then lines are a little bit more deliberate. So I guess this is where we try to encourage them to, no, this is where we talk about the painful stuff, if you want to. This is where we talk about like the stuff we don't understand. This space, we don't know what's in it. Why is that? You know? So like the mapping and unmapping of our experience, I think, is what we're trying to do in these workshops. And here like are some here are some pages in a draft module that I worked on also, that is still also evolving. But if you guys are interested, we can send a PDF of the draft. You can, yeah. One recent experiment I had was to map with political prisoners. When we were detained, like I made like a small drawing of the inside of the place. And then like I tried to expand that idea into what are the spaces in which political prisoners exist. So it's not the question of where are political prisoners, but rather why are political prisoners. You know, to detain dissent has always historically been a tool of authoritarian power because political prisoners is already a definitive kind of silencing. So I made like a draft of my own experience wherein this little panel here shows the time and space of like the arrest, and this little panel here shows the time and space of the actual incarceration, and then the margins around is the time and space, if at all, of the abstract idea of liberation. You know, so like you don't need to necessarily visualize it in a pictorial format. Sometimes it's too abstract. It's an idea. Grant the genuine agrarian reform bill because we were there as peasant advocates. That is an idea of liberation. So I have been visiting also some political prisoners within the past couple of months, and we've been kind of experimenting with this format. It's also a different way of experiencing and participating in the workshop because I can't just facilitate a workshop like in the meeting area of the prisons. Like I just need to verbally leave them with the idea of the workshop and the very loose instructions, and then I come back in a month and then they come up with whatever they come up. And we work with that. Because I guess the general goal for this, like I said, is to understand why there is such a thing. And to understand why there is such a thing is also see a very, very painful contradiction in which people who are fighting the most for liberation is kind of displaced from that reality, wherein it's taken, like their bodies are like physically like kind of detached to their struggle for liberation. So yeah, I mean, so this is my last slide actually, but I guess like I just wanted to kind of end with the idea again of mapping, such as plantations or struggle or militarization. why is it important and why is it kind of, yeah, a crucial task to not to look at maps, but to map out, verb, map as a gesture, different struggles, different contradictions, to understand and then eventually to address these contradictions. And at the same time, while we're trying to map out these contradictions, we find ourselves within it. Sometimes we're not too happy with where we find ourselves within it, but when we still realize that we have agency to decide where we want to be in it. And I hope everyone finds themselves within some sort of position of solidarity. So thank you.
Thank you, Cian. We'll now open up the floor for Q&A. If anybody has any questions, please raise your hand and the mic will be handed to you. Any questions?
This image here is the study for the diagram there. It was from notes when I was working with this peasant leader that went into the studio. That's not a common thing for someone to go to the studio, actually. That's why I put it that. But then I'm just interested in it also. Because it was like, it wasn't talked about like land monopoly and then oligarchs and things. Hashem doesn't play. It wasn't as explicit as this. But this is me kind of like trying to figure out like, where does what fit in this story about vegetables, in this story about vegetables and checkpoints and markets, you know. So there.
Hi, I have a question. Oh, sorry. Hi, I have a question. Oh, by the way, thank you for the talk. It was really interesting and thing. I just have a question about how you made a lot of these drawings and you said this was actually from here, right? And then my question is, how do you actually choose which one to like put in? Like, how do you select the things that you're going to put, like the words especially? Or do you put everything that was in the policy into it? So I hope that's clear.
Well, as in anything, like the idea is bigger than the object. And that's totally fine. And I like the idea that the objects are just little parts of the bigger idea. And then the objects also can have version 2 or version 3. And in a way, like things evolve as maps are static. I mean, it's not a forever representation, but you have to come to terms with these things being artifacts of that then. This is how I understand it then. So in a way, I also showed this tree-like composition here because it also started out as a rough sketch. It became a small tapestry. It became stickers, stickers which I gave out in protests. And then like other people would be, that this doesn't make sense. So it evolved. So there's a lot of kind of moving within these images that are constantly being produced and reproduced and evolve within like my own. In a way, like me making making images is a way to take note of how I understand it. And I think that's fine too, because like other people can clarify, other people can question and contest. Such as how the mining corporations contested that mining poster a while ago. And then we should also just take it all, I guess. But I am also realizing now I didn't talk too much about like the imagery in the work. So these are, if you can, like, yeah, like these are, the background is archival imagery from the early 1900s in American occupation in the Philippines. So I get a lot of material from different archives. So some of these is from a Journal of Public Works in the up to 1930s, something like that. So all is kind of within the context of American occupation. And I'm working with that archive because it's a very rich kind of photographic collection. But I'm also kind of always relating the role of colonialism or neo-colonialism to the experiences of people today. So the embroidered text and images are kind of annotations to these histories on the background. The one with the upside down crocodile, I mean, it's like any other photograph of like a conquered beast, like a slain tiger, and then you post for the trophy photograph. So in a way, that gesture of taking out an apex predator out of its ecosystem to give way for civilization and development, these different contested notions of development, is put to the fore by presenting this as a background. So yeah, land monopoly and land use, all these things that we kind of build our vocabulary of how we understand space, no? Land use and land, it's actually like a violent word. So there, yeah. I just sort of, yeah.
Hello, I have two questions. The first question is, with all your artwork, is quite to be noticeable by many people. How was the situation where some of the peasants or the farmers do not want to be part of the work, or they're afraid how they are painted and how people will understand the situation? And the second one is, with your work being in the eyes of the state government, how do you navigate on censorship or self-censorship, and how you want to able to portray the story but yet still safe enough for you to still practice what you do? So yeah, that's my questions.
Yeah, thanks. I think there's always this need to give justice to the stories that are handed over to me. I think, and I need to consider the context in which they were handed them. These stories, these vulnerable stories, were handed over to me. I guess it also becomes a question of how does one participate in difficult conversations, and how does one participate in art with difficult conversations. And art has always been in kind of like a rocky platform to be critical, because you can be critical but you can be co-opted. You can be co-opted but you can still be critical. There's no right and wrong answer there, I guess. And especially when, I guess, market comes in, no? So like you made a beautiful object out of a very painful story. It's sold in a fair. Like, how fucked up is this? You know? But then that's also kind of like where we're at, no? So we try to be as transparent with the communities that we work with. Before anything, I introduce myself as an artist to kind of disarm it, but I need to also disclose why I am there. I'm not just there to paint you. Like, I'm gonna paint a certain way. But yeah, I get connected with different indigenous and peasant groups through my activism, which is a very loaded connect already. So more often than not, like, they know what to tell me. But of course, once in a while, you get to talk to people who aren't necessarily like politically aligned and may say, and may kind of disclose to you like a detail within their life that they don't want to be shared further. I guess we also need to respect them enough to disclose like to what extent you will use that as an art thing. Like, I haven't gotten full clearance to say the name of the peasant leader that I welcomed and hosted in my studio. So there are these things actually. Like, I always ask them, oh, can we show this work? And then, yeah, you can show this work. Can I show this work in this space? And then we'll ask the higher ups. So there's always like that. And the higher ups meaning like the family members. The higher ups meaning like people who are within the organization that the person represents or is participating in as well. So I guess what I'm trying to say is there are networks of decision making that we may consider or we may not consider. And then and art as well is kind of a very vague And sometimes it's dangerous because it's vague. Because it's not like writing a paper, like an academic paper, that you have to submit in university and then you have to get clearance for ethics review, and wherein you have to cite your sources, otherwise you get kicked out of university. Art is kind of vague. They never ask that. So, like, for all you know, I'm just making this up. But that's the thing also, like, why am I making this up? I'm not an artist. So I'm also kind of asking myself, I'm not a farmer. I never was, like, not in my family. So I'm every day also asking myself, why am I making stuff about the peasant struggle? I'm a middle-class contemporary artist, male, able-bodied, lives in the city kind of guy, goes abroad to talk about art. I'm not a farmer. But that's the thing, like, I'm finding my place within this map. I'm finding my place within the solidarity of it. And every day it makes sense too. But in terms of where we show our work, is also kind of the strategic thing about it. Yeah, there are spaces we don't show in, there are spaces we can't show in, and you can only, I'm sure a lot of you will also know that just because you're an artist doesn't mean you can show in any other museum or gallery that you want. We're also climbing our different ladders with bureaucracy and market and representation and all these things. So we're navigating so many things, actually. Do you self-censor? Because I guess sometimes that's a natural thing, but it's not as explicit as it sounds. Sometimes it looks like self-censorship, but then you're just unsure. Does it make sense? Maybe next time, something like that. Sometimes, I don't know if this is also considered self-censorship, but it can also be a form of protest or resistance if you pull out of something. So there's that thing too. I don't need to get into detail, but I mean, like, there is pulling out as a gesture, as an action also, or not participating, refusing also. The gesture of refusing also is a gesture of resistance, can be a gesture of resistance. Yeah, but actually in terms of Southeast Asia and censorship, like, Philippines is weird because, like, there's barely any censorship because they barely care. So, I mean, the more explicit you are, you show the protest material in a gallery, a museum. They're like, So that kind of, like, makes you question, like, in where actually, like, like, is censorship in art or censorship in action? I don't know. Also, there's that also, because you could say that when we were detained while doing Bongkalan, we were censored too. So that's how I address a question of censorship. But other Southeast Asian countries are interesting too. So yeah.
So I noticed that you use a lot of kind of colonial archival photography. You use, like, the structure of, like, a Murillo Velarde map in some of your works. And obviously, you're talking about reappropriation, annotation, but also this cooptation sometimes, and the risk of, even as you critique some of these structures, you're also risking replicating or repeating some of them. So I think my question comes from this place of how do you navigate the tension between replicating or reinforcing some of those structures, and is annotation enough, or like, where do you go from there?
Yeah. Actually, I was asked this very same question a few weeks ago, and I realized that it's kind of what I'm doing now is what I was doing when I was in grade school, when I would be kind of just drawing on the textbooks. But then in a way, like, what we're doodling on the textbooks is also kind of systematic. I mean, like, we're kind of understanding, we're not actively listening, but maybe you are in different ways, or start figuring yourself out. So I'm kind of interested in the idea of annotating as subversion. I was, like, also kind of reading some like Joma season talk about Jose Rizal. Jose Rizal made like a volume annotating early ethnography in the Philippines, and it was considered as a subversive act because it was seeing that the annotations, no, not the annotations, the ethnography was a colonial thing, and then he was correcting it with the annotation. So in a way, I feel like that's what I'm doing. How other people view the use of archival material is beyond my control. I'm interested in, I guess, how to redistribute the archival material, at least the use of it. Because I guess I also acquired access to this archival material via some sort of privilege of being a contemporary artist. And not everyone can have access to, like a scholar, you know, like a sophomore in like a second year of masters. You have to write a letter. But as a contemporary artist who's making work for this museum, like, oh, sure, look at my archive. Yeah. Okay. And I started out just stealing the photographs, actually. So like a lot of the Dean Worcester photographs from the early 2000s, from the early 1900s, I was stealing from the website, a screenshot, and then I would give it to my friend who would blow them up. And then I can print them like this big or bigger, as a way to like reclaim, right? And from the thumbnails, you can have a lot. There's nothing in the website that says you can't do that, so that's what I did. And then eventually, I got access to the actual archive, which is in Michigan, because I was invited for a mappy thing, and then like, oh, okay, maps, oh, archives. These photographs are there. So a little bit of a background. The Dean Worcester archive that I was telling you about in the early 1900s. So Dean Worcester is a colonial administrator in the Philippines, American colonial administrator in the Philippines. He was just some guy with a camera. He took like thousands of photographs of flora and fauna and landscapes of the Philippines. But the interesting is, because he was a colonial administrator, after his term, he went back into the US and used these photographs to campaign against granting the Philippines early independence. Because with these photographs, he was framing the islands and its people as barbaric and savage. So it's a propaganda thing, and I'm using it the other way around. Anyway, so I found myself in that archive, and then I told them I've been stealing from your archive for years. And then they said, tomorrow, come back with a hard drive. And then sometimes I can't not see how a privilege that is too. But then I'm also kind of like, I said that to be funny, but then like I didn't know they were gonna invite me the next day to bring a hard drive. And then they said also that we've been trying to repatriate some of this stuff. Every year we've been going to the Philippines trying to return it. And you know what? All these dirty politicians have been just facing us. They just want the photo ops and they don't really know what to do. And I said, no, that's true. And then like, I don't know, but I'm taking your photographs. And then they said, please do. Because like we see what you're doing. And this is how, like on a personal level, not to speak for the institution, but on a personal level. So we work with these different frequencies, like personal, organizational. You try not to overstep it. I try to, at least once a year, compile these images into a PDF and send a nice email with a link and wishing you well. I did this month. I don't know. They actually also said to share it with other friends. So like, but that's also a big task because what does that even mean, right? I can't just put it in a Google Drive and because that's also irresponsible to. So now I don't know. Now I'm lost. Why do I have this? So there, archival, access to these things, and responsibility in annotating. Yes, they are also kind of being brought up to life within their violent existence. I think I'm fighting back with a different kind of violence also. I can't say my work isn't violent too, but I like to think of it as like a justice-oriented violence. but that's just me. Like, yeah.
Any other questions?
Thank you for the talk. I'm very curious how your practice evolved throughout the very beginning of your practice, and especially in terms of your research method. And my second question is, if you were to go back to the very beginning of your art practice, would you do anything differently? Yeah.
I don't know. Like, so I went to art school for undergrad. Actually, not like I was in philosophy first, and then, but like for a sem or two. Or what. Anyway, art school. But I had very strict parents. So if I didn't have very strict parents, I would have been like painting bad boy paintings. But I had to be craftsy with my bad ideas. So I made it kind of conceptual and kind of like jabbing at institutions with an installation instead of a bad boy painting. But a lot of the images that I was making from the early years of my practice was influenced by like folk Christianity and religious imagery. Actually, it might be evident in a lot of the insignia that is in the maps. Like the Catholic, the Christian visual language is super interesting because it's highly codified. It's like, you know, like symbolism, numbers, composition, which is also how maps work. No? Like the colors of each landform is telling of who colonized them. So kind of like jumping into different kind of visual languages of power relations. Maybe it's just also stemming from adolescent rebelliousness as a young art student. But a lot of the work from the very beginning was kind of questioning authority. So some of my first exhibitions were kind of like poking at museum display to kind of understand how museums as institutions dictate heritage and power. So my first show in 2013 was a fake archaeological complex that was presented in exhibition. So I was playing around with the language of museum writing and then pedestals with badly done ceramics. I made like stone tools. Like I planted moss on it, made it look antique. But you know, like it was just like a big joke, but kind of talking about museums and power. So I guess I'm just playing around with different things that projected power, from mythologies to museums to monuments, maps. Just coincidentally, they're all M. Has nothing to do with anything. No, I wouldn't change any. Yeah. Maybe I'd pay more attention in class. Because, I mean, like actually, because a lot of the work a lot of the themes that my work is about is within all the different social science disciplines that I've immersed myself with as an outsider. So as an art school undergrad, I just sit in on the Anthro conference, or I just hang out with my history friends as an art student. Until now, I feel like I'm like just the token artist in the geography department. And then that is actually what they're wanting me to talk about. Like, your practice is geography. You should write about how your practice is geography. And then like, sure. Sure. So it's interesting actually to kind of see yourself within the periphery of disciplines. And I think that's how a practice can grow. To be kind of playing novice, but also kind of pushing the boundaries of interdisciplinary understanding. It also kind of pushes the boundaries of multi-epistemic understanding and solidarity. I mean, if you look at the orientation of an activist group, they're not all political science. No, they're humanities. They're like landscape architecture, like engineers. It's all different people collectively trying to build like a better world through these different ideas of hope. So I guess that's also how we build ourselves, not just within our own. Sorry, I'll stop. Yeah, there was another question. Yeah. But I hope that kind of addressed. Yeah, I think. Yeah, I always think about that too.
Hi, how serious or playful do you feel normally when you are at work? Because the homework tends to be quite heavy going.
Yeah.
So how do you feel when you're at work? I'm just curious.
My wife was here a while ago. And then she said, within the past couple of years, you've gotten a lot less funny. Yeah. And I guess that's very true too. It's hard to, it's hard to kind of, it's a lot of heavy work. But kind of sometimes it's how it becomes kind of like an attitude of taking things, because like I can't reinterpret the story any other way than through a little bit of humor. And if anything, like I kind of still laugh at myself or myself and other people I work with, like Shao. Like we're talking about plantations in a museum. And sometimes this laugh is also a fuel. No, like it's a fuel for like us making us stronger tomorrow. It's also kind of catching our breath, because we're all like every day we're catching all this heavy news, and sometimes laughing is catching your breath. And if you can laugh about it, but still remain focused. You have to remain focused. I guess it's kind of like a sharp laugh, Again, like I don't know, like I'm remembering a Jose Rizal reference wherein like someone was writing about humor in Jose Rizal's novels, and it's a lot of kind of like anti-colonial satire in the Philippines. But then I read like a short essay about humor in it, which I never really thought of. But then like humor in anti-colonial satire, like yeah, of course satire, but then like it's also kind of like the animalistic gesture of showing your teeth as like defending yourself. Maybe there is something to look into also, because at the end of the day, what we're trying to do by making art about all these historical stories of oppression is to find different ways to talk about it. Not to water it down, but to catch up to different ways people understand now. And sometimes if it works for me to kind of be a little bit light, to talk about it, maybe it would help a bit to kind of translate this narrative. Sometimes I try not to be too didactic. Also, this is a very didactic work, I would say. It literally says land monopoly. I could have been more poetic with this, but sometimes I can't. And then my wife's like, what? Land monopoly? Come on. And then I'm like, what? So I guess there can be better versions of this particular piece. And we shouldn't be afraid of that, because we can always revise and make new ones. But yeah, that's also, I guess, like taking it light. The idea of being kind of aware of its materiality. It's in KL. It's not in a community in Bulacan, like not outside Manila. So in a way, like it's also like the realization that like it's for a specific platform also. It's kind of, yeah. Yeah.
Are there any other questions? Oh, that's right.
I'm curious because Manila's political environment is so much harsh than Malaysia. Do you ever get threatened?
I can't compare really in terms of the different, I actually show more work outside the Philippines. But I still have a presence in the Philippine art scene. And similar to the question of censorship in Manila, it's more of like they don't really care. Or one way of threatening is just not showing up. Maybe it's some people's way of boycotting me, as if like I'm dependent on like other people's viewership. But then even as is, I guess, like I don't know how to quantify artistic reach in terms of numbers of viewership. So if you show in a gallery in Manila, depends on how popular you are, but how many people go into your opening, like 150? 50 people, 70, 100? How many people walk into the gallery within the 3-week show or the 1-week show? Like another 100 at most. So how do you make sense out of these numbers? No? And within the, say, 100, 200 people at most who physically see your work, it's a very specific demographic of people who see art. So sometimes what's scary is the realization that I'm talking to a very small amount of people, and you feel small as well, but it's already addressing more than one person, I guess. And it's not like you're the only one talking about it, I guess. And I comfort myself with the idea that I'm not the only one talking about this. I think in contemporary art platforms from the Philippines, like I'm one of a few, but I'm not the only one. Perhaps I'm the one who is one of the ones who are most explicit about it. Land monopoly. In a biennale. So there is, there is that question mark always in my head. In terms of threatened, I don't know how to, well, other than, actually being, like, participating in direct action and facing, like, physical and legal threats, well, that's one, but that's not an everyday case. But I guess threatened in a sense, yes, threatened in a sense that living conditions in general. But I guess that can also be shared, that sentiment is also shared by everyone else. There is like no health care, no free education. So like we're all constantly threatened by how bad society is in terms of lack of social services, on how like a dictator dynasty is running. And then we're all kind of faced with it every day. I think that's enough threat. That we have to together address. Yeah. Thank you. Yes.
Hi, I want to know, is there any religious reform in the Philippines and the role of religion and activism? And that two questions.
Yep.
And then another question is, it is more about from the perspective of the artist, not from the peasants. As an outsider, when I look at the Philippines artists' work, there is a certain kind of aesthetics, which is nurtured by the Christian iconography. So when we talk about land liberation, have you ever thought of like, visual language kind of liberation? These are my questions. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, actually, yeah. It's a very long conversation. Um, its influence at large, yes, but influence in what direction is also like a big question mark. Um, don't know where the church itself as a monolithic hierarchical institution stands within, say, peasant struggle. Um, we almost had a pope the other day, but the pope is an American now. But then there is that. I mean, like the Philippines, no abortion, no divorce, like very big wall against whatever reproductive health bill. So I don't know if like the Cardinal Tagle would have, like, I don't know where he would put the Philippines or his positionality as a Filipino had he become Pope. I don't know. So very, very little representation or solidarity from the church or any church in terms of struggles for national liberation. Very little, but yes, there is. Actually, the anting-antings or the talismans that I was referencing in some of my works are kind of like quasi-religious objects that are used by early anti-colonial revolts. So I tap into that particular history, actually, as why I'm interested in that vocabulary of the anting-anting, occult crossing over to liberation. It's not entirely my thing, actually, the occult. I was raised like very Catholic, but I was like, as a kid. But I seem to have developed a kind of healthy relationship with any kind of faith practice. In national liberation activism in the Philippines, there are several allied churches or churchy initiatives like rural missionaries of the Philippines, things like that, who actually practice some sort of like liberation theology. Sometimes when I go into communities, there would be, I forget this church, but like I'm always with this like on tangent with this church group that they do the medical missions and the free dental stuff, but then they're also like there in the fact-finding missions for human rights violations. They're there. Small group always, but then they're there. Never really worked with them directly, but then I am like with deep respect to them. And actually, like I am interested in like how they connect things together. On my part, I'm also, I guess, kind of like a spectator in these interfaith initiatives. So I work alongside like progressive church groups, as you would say, when I go to different communities of indigenous national minorities. So it's usually within that context of interfaith solidarity, which is interesting, actually. I'm not too versed with its history, but it is definitely present. Yeah, its influence in my imagery is what I got, I guess, like I'm stemming from my own experience as a Catholic kid growing up. Yeah. But yeah, I think I have a healthy history with the idea of it. but I also recognize how the church, like the big church, is also kind of like leaning towards like right wing or complacency with human rights violations of different administrations. But I see it as more of like a structural kind of hierarchical diplomatic thing. They're kind of like managing their power within such society. So it's a lot of money too. It's a lot of land too. Yeah.
Perhaps we could have one more question before we close the session.
Magandang gabi po. So earlier you mentioned you did not come from a family of farmers, right? So I was wondering what triggered you to start on this critical and niche subject in your art? Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. I guess how far back do you want me to tell this story? No, yeah, I guess like a little bit of a personal note, actually. Go back to one. I was showing you these works about these haciendas. This one. I told you about Hacienda Luisita. A lot of people found out about Hacienda Luisita in 2004 because, I mean, like in popular consciousness, because of Hacienda Luisita massacre, wherein organized farm workers protested outside the gates of the azucarera, it's a sugarcane thing, to ask for their land back. They were met with violence, people were shot at, and 13 people died at that time, 2004. So I was in high school at the time. And then, of course, it wasn't just the farmers, it was the advocates, like activists from the city, students, I guess people like me now were there. Some of them are filmmakers, so it was one of those live streamed things, you know. And no, not live streamed, like recorded on video. So naturally, the filmmakers who survived the shooting came home with some really visceral imagery of the actual shooting, people bleeding. Not a pretty sight, of course. We know this in history. There are a line of peasant massacres in Philippine history, and not just in Philippine history. But this one was filmed. So the filmmakers who shot this came home with these footages and started making a documentary out of it. That was November 2024. I was in third year high school, and our history professor showed us a draft of this documentary. So I say it's a draft because I'm trying to imagine the timeline from when before the school year ended to when this happened. So it must have been a draft. So I saw this draft and thought like, oh, that stuff happens. That stuff happens in that nearby. It's kind of like a political awakening via a small documentary that my history professor showed me. I didn't like seek out and join any particular activist groups, but I let it brew like any other teenager at the back of the class. Maybe I was annotating some of the textbook drawings. But it sat with me until university. When I got into university, it was a different president altogether, but then like this different president, some would think like she's a great economist, but at the same time very staunch anti-communist and very violent. So the terms extrajudicial killings was kind of more into the imaginary of people. So it's kind of like part of growing up, me, like the idea of a farmer who's kind of oppressed. The idea of oppression at large, I would say started with that documentary. And that's why I did this work in 2018, because I was just like going back, like graduated college and sort of just doing your thing and then going in and out of activism. Like, some people would say like activism is such a studenty thing to do, but at the same time, like I found myself deeper in it as a parent, because it's also kind of part of how I want my children to sort of know the world and kind of see power. So that was in 2004. I was in high school. And why I put these two together, the lawyer that represented me when we were detained and arrested and given criminal charges happens to be that same high school teacher. So like he was just like teaching high school after graduating and then went to art school after. And then we saw each other again, and he's my lawyer. And then like I said, this is your doing. And he said like, yeah, well, we're all in it together, no? So I guess that's one such example of like, I would say like political awakening, like as an adolescent, just like started with a lot of questions and realizations. Being in art school also helped a lot, because a lot of us can also kind of question what is the role of art today in society, what is art school even? But my idea of it, like the best thing I learned in art school is to shut up and observe. When you're drawing like a face, you don't draw the face from your imagination in art school. You have to draw the face, the model that you're copying based on how you see it. So you have to rid yourself first of your own, at least try, of your bias or your idea of what the face is. You practice looking. So in a way, that's also kind of instrumental with like how I kind of look at landscapes. I just like look first with all objective. I mean, everything is politicized, but everything still has to be objective, like cold and objective. Yet, like, you know, like the fire of pain and humor is also kind of like coloring it all. So yeah, but yeah, high school, 2004, Hacienda Luisita massacre. Still no justice today, but yeah, no justice today in all the peasant massacres. You know, like governments, administrations, regimes, all like go on with impunity. Like why is there even a history of peasant massacre? Why is that even a thing? Peasant massacre, political prisoner, and yeah. So I'm sorry to end with such a heavy note, but yeah.
Yeah, I guess with that, thank you very much, Cian. Let's give him a round of applause, everyone.
Thank you.